To speed track efforts to combat this disease hitting a roadblock. The Wall Street Journal this morning reporting that THERANOS is withdrawing its request for clearance for its Zika blood test. That's after regulators found that the diagnostics company did not follow patient safeguards. This comes as pressure is growing for private companies to take matters into their own hands. Theme parks, for example, in Orlando, now offering free bug spray. Here to weigh in, former HHS Secretary and former Utah Governor Michael Leavitt. Governor, good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Good morning.
So has the government dropped the ball on this, forcing private sector companies to step up?
Well, I would say two things. One is that no one should expect that the government will be the solution to everything in a situation where there's a pandemic risk. Everyone needs to have a plan to make certain that they protect themselves. Now, the government does have some unique responsibilities. One is being able to establish credible tests, and the other is hopefully a vaccine at some point.
Well, I mean, look, we had fears of Zika taking a toll on communities. We had a primary polling station at the Miami Beach Botanical Garden had to be moved to City Hall because authorities are inspecting for Zika in the area. So could this actually threaten voter turnout in this swing state?
Pandemics are part of natural life, and they happen periodically. We have not had one for more than 40 or 50 years now. One could say we're sort of overdue. And when they happen, there's a lot of things that are disrupted. And pandemic viruses, they don't care about elections or anything else.
Right, so you think it could?
Seeking to spread around.
So are you worried about that? It's going to impact the election then?
Well, I think that would be a bit of an exaggerated headline, but I do think it is a credible threat to human beings, and it has to be dealt with.
Yeah, Louise.
There's a British company I know that was researching in a kind of mosquito that is neutered, so it doesn't reproduce. You release them into the population, and they cut the population by being unable to reproduce. So, a bit like the way that flea medicines work on dogs. They interrupt that life cycle. So I think the government has to look at all kinds of scientific responses to cut down the Zika virus. But it's not going to stay in Florida. It's going to come up here to New York and across the country. We're going to have to live with it and take precautions.
And this is a gender issue, too, because if you talk to men, no offense to the secretary, they have a very different reaction than young women who are of childbearing age. There is a deep-seated fear that could easily turn into something even bigger than fear, but in terms of panic, if this is not handled in a way from the government down, not from the individual up.
Governor, I have a quick question for you. From the in 1934, when the dengue virus had hit Key West, the government was massively aggressive on that and literally killed everything in sight, like they did in Rio, Brazil, 3 weeks ago. Do you think we should be more aggressive in our response to what's going on related to Zika?
Yes, I do. I think there's always a need to be aggressive when there is a virus with pandemic potential. The problem with pandemics is that anything that happens in advance of the pandemic maturing seems alarmist. Anything that happens after is inadequate. And we're in that period of time when it becomes pretty clear that we're going to see Zika on this hemisphere, or rather in this country, and people are beginning to feel properly concerned about it. And I do think it is, at this moment, looking back, the Congress has failed to act to fund this. Now, there's a lot of debate about that. Could I just say, I think it's ridiculous that we don't have in this country a stockpile of money that says when these things hit, we can deploy on them. And we have this debate every time there's a virus. The Congress needs to create a long-term plan to deal with this so that they can respond more quickly.
Yeah, you make a good point, Governor. Let me switch gears, ask you about the presidential nominees' transition teams. Politico is reporting that Trump's approach to unveiling his transition team is to have Governor Chris Christie host a $5,000 per person fundraiser just for a small group of people to get insight on his transition team plans. You led Mitt Romney's transition team. What's your take on Trump's approach?
Well, it's just a little perspective. There is a law called the Presidential Transition Act of 2010. It's a brand new law. We acted under it in 2012 for the first time. It requires that a candidate essentially fund their own transition plan until they have won the election, at which time there are some government resources, some cash that goes into the transition. So they have to raise money, and the law requires that they do it in proportion no greater than $5,000, and so there's a fundraising effort involved. And I think what undoubtedly is occurring is that, though I have no unique insight into this, I suspect that both campaigns are meeting with people who have maxed out on their campaign and saying, here's another way you can help, and they're describing what's happening in the transition. It's simply a fundraising process that they're going through.
Is there anything in terms of transitions that you think is vital or most important that should be said ahead of this taking place?
Transitions are enormously important. Countries are vulnerable during periods of transition, and the scope of these is just massive. You have to put a team on the field, you have to be prepared with, and that involves as many as 4,000 people over time. But it's a big job, and it needs to be done, and it needs to be done well.
Governor, good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us. Michael Leavitt joining us there. Still to